So we're going to look at sort of best practices. We've talked a lot about that today, so I won't go into them in too much particular detail, but also thinking, what does the ICO expect? What do we advise and suggest and also mark as effective security? And talk about how you can demonstrate that to the ICO if the worst should happen. Let's all be grown up and acknowledge that data breaches happen. In a lot of cases, the security people are doing their best, but how can they demonstrate that to the ICO? We've heard a lot about GDPR before the coffee break. I wasn't going to talk about that. Again, I was going to focus on what's happening now. Think about the next 18 months. So again, we still have data breaches now. We need to focus on those now and not wait 18 months and have another 18 months of data breaches. But also a lot of what we'll talk about the sort of direction of travel as well, so it will also be relevant. So anyone that hasn't heard of the ICO, where have you been? I'll sign you a copy of the Data Protection Act if you want on the way out. But there's our sort of mission statement, upholding information rights. We've got 5 specific pieces of legislation that we do regulate. The one that's most applicable and most appropriate in information security is obviously the Data Protection Act, looking towards and really protecting that personal data that you're processing as a data controller. Interesting on the sort of Brexit side of things, 4 of those actually stem from European legislation as well. So we're also quite interested in what will happen and when the Article 50 big button is going to be pushed. But we can perhaps talk about that in some questions at the end. If you've read our 2015-16 annual report, and if not, why not? It was a thrilling read. But you will see that certainly self-reported data protection incidents that have been received by our office are up 17.2%. All data protection concerns that have been reported to us are up 15%. But specifically, thinking about security-related concerns that have been reported, that's between 8 and 9% of those particular figures. So it's still quite an important aspect of our work, but not to the sole exclusion of everything we do. You'll also know about civil monetary penalties that we issue for breaches of the Data Protection Act. That's up to £500,000. So in the same financial year, so last year we issued 2.5 million of penalties. Now, just to mention about the one that we've talked, that's already been mentioned a little bit before, the TalkTalk penalty that was issued and then they appealed the tribunal decision last week. That was not a penalty for the TalkTalk breach, which you might be thinking about. It was for a failure for them to notify the ICO about a TalkTalk data breach. And it was a penalty for £1,000 because they didn't notify within 24 hours. Rather than it's a fixed penalty, we can't vary the amount. It's £1,000, you didn't notify. So there you go, thanks very much. The investigation into the larger TalkTalk breach is still ongoing, but I won't say any more about that. So if you're still not convinced that you have to do cybersecurity for compliance with the Data Protection Act, hopefully you can look at these kind of numbers and be convinced that your customers, your clients, also demand it. So this is a statistic from our 2014 annual track survey, which we commission every year to look at what individuals think about the Data Protection Act. If you look at this 2016 report, again, it's the same sort of thing. So individuals are less likely to take up new services if they don't trust the provider to keep their personal data secure. And only 16% of organizations, 16% of individuals think that organizations are doing enough to keep their information secure. And we did a YouGov poll earlier in the year to mark European Data Protection Day. That also showed that 20% of people would definitely stop using a particular organization if they suffered a data breach. 57% would consider stopping using that particular service. So that means you're around about 80% of your potential customer base could walk out the door if you suffered a personal data breach. So that should certainly start focusing your minds as well. And then when we look at things like GDPR coming along the line, so if breach of security could be a fine of up to 2% of your global annual turnover, which obviously could be quite a large number, or €2 million. Again, we'll have to see what happens with GDPR to see where that's around. But hopefully those kind of figures should certainly help focus the minds of your chief executive or CFO. And again, it's always worth reminding people that it's 2% of annual turnover and not profit. I know a person that was speaking to some organizations, some startups in California, and they were saying, it doesn't matter, we don't make any money. We're just burning our VC capital. It doesn't matter, we're not making a profit. So, no. It's not about profit. It's about your global turnover. So we've already seen this slide as well already today. It's a nice one that just puts up the principles of the Data Protection Act. And again, what we're looking at, Principle 7, personal information must be secure. Now, although It's the smallest one in there, so the fewest number of words. It's probably the most important, certainly when you've got that data and you're trying to keep it secure. But also thinking about information security does affect all of the other principles. So again, don't just think it's focused on the security. So for example, a good IT system will help you keep that data accurate and up to date. If you've got all these disparate Excel spreadsheets in various workstations around the office, they're all going to be out of date. But a good IT system can help that. Can help with the data subject, Principle 6, access rights. If you've got one source of information where people can come in, perhaps have a dashboard online to get access to that data, can help with your data subject requests. Or international transfers, or making sure that data isn't excessive and it's still adequate. So again, thinking about, well, what backups do you have? Can you recover from those? It will help with all of your other principal requirements. So let's have a focus on security. Think about what can you do in advance of a data breach. As I said it before, let's be a little bit grown up and think, well, a data breach will happen. Maybe let's start to adopt that position. What can we put in place to make sure that we're in the best position? And then if that data breach doesn't happen, well, that's even better, rather than pretending it's never going to happen and then running around like a headless chicken if it does happen. What we need to do is really make sure things are kept up to date and also proportionate to our the current threats. But there's obviously a number of likely scenarios that you can imagine. Pick any top 10 list of threats. How will they affect my organization? Work through them in a real-world scenario in your organization. Run those scenarios and see what happens. But importantly, learn from the mistakes or learn from the outcomes of that. What did you find wrong? But certainly, there's a whole number of different potential points in your organization where these things can affect. If you're operating online, there's obviously a particular type of cyber threats there. But if you're using email or cloud computing, again, think about what's there and where those threats are. An easy example maybe to look at ransomware, because it's the number one threat perhaps at the moment. I found some statistics from a Symantec report yesterday. So then in 2015, there were 100 different variants of ransomware, and between 23,000 and 35,000 infections a month, which I thought that's quite a big number. But what I find interesting, especially with ransomware, is why is it such a big problem? Because we've had backups and disaster recovery for how long? So certainly in an organization perspective, it shouldn't actually matter to your organization whether everything got encrypted. Okay, there's going to be some downtime to bring it all back online again. But why are people paying these ransoms? Well, because they don't have a backup. So clearly we're failing on that backup and that recovery. But what you can do is look at your organization. If you get affected by ransomware, think about the different points where that could get affected. So you've got your maybe handheld devices or mobile phones. You've got desktops, laptops in your servers. But even think about your employees if they're doing remote working from home. Okay, it may not affect your core business and your data if their home computer gets infected with ransomware. But if they can't do any work because they can't open and turn on their computer because it's encrypted, that's still going to affect your business because they can't come to work, essentially, and do that remote working. So there's a number of different places where you can get affected. And then think about, well, what have you done about that? Run an exercise to actually test and see how effective or what problems are going to be. So what logging have you got in place? Would you actually know which user account perhaps caused the infection or where it started? Would you have a backup to be able to restore from that? I did hear an example of an employee, their computer was the source of the infection. They got infected, I think, sort of 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. They double-clicked a URL and ransomware got in and started encrypting their machine. Things were running a bit slowly. So what do? Well, they knocked off early. So what happens? That device gets completely encrypted. You think, okay, fine, we could recover that, we could restore that. What it then did is then got into the rest of the network and started encrypting all of that. Now, it was a Friday, kicked over into Saturday. On Friday, that's when the daily backup ran. So then, because everything was encrypted, the daily backup was also backing up the encrypted files. So that daily backup was ineffective. It was the end of the week. Then the weekly backup kicked in, and that backed up all of the encrypted files. So now you've got the daily backups fully encrypted and not any use. The weekly backup is no use. It was also the end of the month. So then the end of the month backup, the system that they had running, also started to back up all of the encrypted files. So the system that they had in place, they thought was good because, we've got a weekly backup, we've got all these different snapshots, we could roll back. Because the infection happened on that last Friday of the month, essentially wiped them all out. So again, it's thinking, how can you recover from those different points where you might get infected from it and when? And these are things you can test in advance. You don't have to wait. I wouldn't suggest you infect one of your machines intentionally, but you can simulate these things in quite a reasonably controlled environment. Well, think about it. Do your employees have those admin accounts that they shouldn't have on their regular machines? Will they actually get infected in any way? Or postulate and think, well, if that machine did get infected, what's the furthest that it could go? You can think about that with ransomware, but also if an attacker got on, maybe you've got a blog site, right, WordPress or any other kind of content management system. Inherently unstable, there's got a lot of plugins that can have a lot of vulnerabilities. If that got compromised, where's the furthest that an attacker could get to? And then think about, well, what could you do to avoid that in the first place? Get the training in to those individuals. We've already heard about the insider threat or the education to those employees. And this all comes back to, so if that event happened and you had the cyber breach or the data breach, came to the ICO and said, look, this has happened, these are the sorts of questions that I'm going to be asking you, and say, well, what did you do in advance to try and prepare for this, to protect yourself against that? I did have some sympathy with our, was it Lucifer? That was Lucifer, that was it. Certainly from my perspective, I don't see the data controller as a victim. Clearly from the eyes of a Computer Misuse Act or the police, yes, they are a victim. A crime has been inflicted against them. But in my role and what I'm investigating is what did the organization, what did the data controller have in place to protect the individuals who their data was being processed? Essentially the data subjects to the victim that I'm trying to protect and get a rectification for. So you've done all that, you've implemented your findings, you've looked at the threats that you've got in your networks, make improvements, do it again. Find another one of those top 10 vulnerabilities. Repeat it all again with an SQL injection. Repeat it all with cross-site scripting. Look at what data you've actually got. Have a look at admin passwords. When were they last changed? Have you actually deleted the admin passwords of the people that have left and no longer work for you? All these things you can be doing on a daily basis or a monthly basis and looking, trying to prevent these particular threats. Like I said, there's a whole number of lists that you can get hold of. You don't have to sit in an office and come up with these potential threats on your own. There's a number of different lists available. Or get some sort of security audits and basics in there. We've got Cyber Essentials, we haven't got a logo of, which is a government-backed scheme. Again, that's starting to look at all of the basics. A number of the data breaches that we've investigated and ultimately issued enforcement action against really been because that data controller wasn't even doing the basics. We're talking about not having updated their software in years, not just within perhaps 30 days of their particular policy. It's a matter of storing passwords in plain text and just going, yeah, we should do something about that. We've known about it for 5 years, we'll wait. That's not good enough, and that's what we're talking about, getting those basics right. And again, probably about 2 years ago now, we wrote this report. So what we did is we took a lot of the data breaches that have been reported to the ICO and tried to pick out those common threads within there. Now, it probably doesn't surprise you to know that there's a great overlap between sort of things like the OWASP top 10 or other top vulnerability lists. It's still there, sort of SQL injection attacks, it's poor password storage and choice, updating and patch management. All of those things, those data controllers are still getting wrong, rather than focus on those very, very basic things, rather than think about the advanced threats. Let's think about what else is online in your network. Obviously, kind of thinking about Internet of Things, but also other devices that are online, your video surveillance cameras, printers, scanners, FTP sites or data storage. They can all very easily get put online. And again, you might think, oh, we're a big organization, FTSE 100, it's fine, we've got a nice secure data center. Actually, we'll go and have a walk around. You may even find a network storage device attached to a router, because one of the techies thought, I just need to do a bit of data transfer here and there. Go and have a look and see what's actually happening on the floor.
Nearly there.
Yep, very nearly there. I think I've got, yes. All right, let's skip over that one. Just talk very much about notification. So we've got a link on our website, so you can report a data breach. This was mentioned a little bit earlier. We're not saying you need to report or give me a full list of everything that went wrong within 24 hours or 72 hours. A very, very basic security breach notification will be good enough for a short period. So again, that's going back to the investigation or the penalty against TalkTalk last week that was appealed. we weren't saying we didn't want a big full penetration test that went to 100 odd pages. Well, actually just give us the notification and you can follow up later on when more information becomes available. And what we want to know about in the breach notification report is really what is the risk to the individuals? Do they need to be notified? And what can they do about it to protect themselves? Think about it as them, their personal data, they're now at risk because of that breach. Was it their credit card data that they might now need to follow up on or cancel? Was it their passwords that they might need to reset across other services and so on? There's some other quick breaches which I can go through, ask me questions about afterwards. But again, very easily, Money Shop, they lost their computer equipment, couldn't, stolen out of shops, got a breach of a penalty of 180,000. Stay sure they weren't keeping up with their software update policy. Think W3 was an SQL injection attack. BPAS, another one, an SQL injection attack. Made even worse that they lost data that didn't even know was being collected by their website. Again, look at your databases, see what data is in there. And I'll leave that there for you to read.